Let me just say that briefly again. Thank you for joining us for Hindu University of America's webinar on negationism, the willful distortion of Indian history. Let me hand it over to Kalyanji, who will give this webinar some context and get us set up and started. Kalyanji.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. And Dr. Konrad Elst, thank you very much for joining us from Belgium today. And I want to extend a warm welcome to all the people who are in the webinar. Let me just ask a question to everybody in the webinar. Where are you joining from? Where are you joining from? Just type in the city from where you're participating today. Okay. Yeah, New Jersey, Seattle, Honolulu. Wow. Okay. Louisville, Virginia, Santa Rosa, New Delhi, Gaithersburg, Los Angeles, Houston, Milwaukee, Naples, Salt Lake City, Italy. All right. Los Angeles, Glasgow, Scotland. Okay. Ann Arbor, Michigan. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Very good. So welcome, a very warm welcome to all of you. Now we have a Q&A box. We have a chat box and a Q&A box. So I want to just let you all know that we will curate questions from the Q&A box towards the end of the webinar and respond to those questions. We won't pick up questions from the chat box, okay? So kindly put your questions in the Q&A box. So that's very important. Now, before we get started with the webinar itself, I'd like to properly introduce Dr. Konrad Elst in his own words. And I'm going to ask him a question. Dr. Konrad Elst, how did you wander into the realm of India studies and, all that you've done, starting out from a Catholic university in Belgium? How did that happen? Can you give us a little background?
Yeah, well, Catholicism is something that I have outgrown pretty early, 14, 15 years of age, which was very common in my generation. That was not so difficult. It's not like leaving Islam, which is more fraught with challenges. But at the same time, I was hearing about Hinduism, which was very fashionable in those days. But the first word of Sanskrit I ever learned, as far as I remember, is the word sandhi, the joining of sounds, neighboring sounds in a sentence. That principle is also used in our language. Only the term came from Sanskrit because the whole science of linguistics is actually born from the discovery by Europeans of Panini and the other Sanskrit grammarians. So anyway, then there were pictures I saw of really gilded, really nice pictures of all the scenes of the Mahabharata. And that got me really interested. Then when I was a young lad, I used to go to Amsterdam. And in order to save money, I went to the Hare Krishna place, where every day they gave some really good food. And in exchange, of course, I listened to their discourses. They liked that. So I learned a few things. Then also in Amsterdam at age 20 or so, I heard of Swami Hariharananda of the Kriya Yoga tradition. So I went to his lecture. I really was fired up. I took his Diksha. And so, I mean, I sort of rolled into it. Then when I wanted to do something serious, Orientalism was a logical thing to do. However, one special thing I want to say is that I was not really interested in India. I was interested in Hinduism. And when I finished my studies, I had just had a really nasty, about 1 year long chronic disease. And I thought, I'm never going to India because this is the country of malaria and leprosy and everything.
Yeah.
A philosopher doesn't have to go there. But then I ended up in India anyway, and then it was love at first sight.
Okay, wonderful. Now, So you got your PhD from the same university, Catholic University. Is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I did, after my MA, I did a year of, a postgraduate program in Varanasi.
Mm.
But through family circumstances, I had to break that off and come back home. But so
Mm.
there I had started already on a PhD program, which so then I had to discontinue and then I restarted in my home university.
Mm.
But anyway, it then the next year brought me back to India for some field work. This was about the Hindu political movement. In those days, it was very easy to get access to those people. Nowadays, it's all security.
Mm. Okay. And you started to have some intersections with people like Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup and so on. Can you share a little bit about that part of
Yes.
your history?
Yeah, you see, with Sitaram Goel, it's a well-known story by now, but I like to remember it. So I went to I was in Delhi for a week or so for some paperwork, and I went to the Daryaganj publishers area to some bookshops. And so there I found this book, History of Hindu-Christian Encounters,
Mm.
which interested me a lot. So I read the book in like one day.
Mm.
Then I went back to the bookshop, and to my surprise, the bookseller said, "Well, if you want, you can meet the writer because he
Mm.
has an office just a block down."
Mm.
So that's when it happened, and it was like I think November or December '89, and it was a very big turning point in my life
Mm.
because you see, until then, I was in the situation as most India watchers, who come to India and don't understand anything and
Mm.
just, take the version that they hear in the cocktail circuits from the Indian secularists. And me, by contrast, I got a ringside view. I mean, he explained everything. And so that's from there I proceeded.
Yeah. So Sitaram Goel was a turning point for you, basically.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Now, getting into the webinar itself for today, uh, I want to start out with a question. Every historian, regardless of their persuasion and orientation, they do have a choice as to which facts they select and which facts they ignore in order to build a story about what
Yeah.
really happened in the past. Because after all, the writing of history is a kind of reconstruction anyway. And so people are selecting certain facts, they are selecting certain artifacts of history, uh, and they're building a story around it. Um, so, can the writing of history ever be freed from the inherent predispositions of a scholar to tell a particular story? I mean, let's start there before we get
Yeah.
into
Okay.
specific distortions.
Well, I think we have to maintain at least the ideal of objectivity. And we have to be critical for our own predispositions and our own biases and try to discard them as much as possible. And so asymptotically approach to objectivity. So I mean those people who say, well, there is no such thing as objectivity, that is too lax. But I agree, of course, that we are imperfect and we rarely reach that ideal. However, in the problem of history denial, there you get something that cannot be so easily excused. You can't say, oh, well, how can you expect objectivity? No, you have people who really go quite far away from this ideal because they think their biases are more important.
Mm.
But to some extent, I can also understand. You see, when I was a kid, history was still uh, much oriented towards battles and political events. And then, they got the more economic and cultural emphasis later on. And so I think, if you try to see the bright side, the Indian leftist historians went through something similar, that religion and therefore also religious conflict is not that important. You see, the modes of production and the labor relations and so on, they haven't been given enough attention. And so we are going to correct that. So, but then unfortunately, they went over to the other extreme.
Mm. Mm. Okay. So you have coined the term negationism,
Yeah.
right? And you've written a book on it. In fact, there is a whole book, Negationism in India, Concealing the Record of Islam. And that's your book that
Mhm.
was published probably, what, 15 years ago, maybe? Or even more
Well,
than that?
the very first version was, I think, 91. It
Wow.
originated as a book review,
Mm.
which explains some of the formal characteristics of the text, but then it got longer and longer and it became a book in its own right.
Mm.
But the revised version with a new introduction is from 2014.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, what do you mean by the term negationism? Okay, and I mean, is it a term that's applicable universally? Is it applicable only to India studies? I mean, how do you see that term really apply?
Well, it's originally a French term, négationnisme, which applies specifically to the denial of the Jewish Holocaust during the Second World War.
I see.
So, um, after the Second World War, this story of what had happened to the Jews was not generally known. And when it, was rumored, then some people just didn't believe it for different reasons. Usually not because they were so fond of the Nazis and tried to whitewash them. So the person with whom it started, Paul Racinier, had himself been a resistor, and he had been caught and spent time in a concentration camp. And so his own experiences did not correspond to what he heard. And so he, tried to correct that, to give his own version. And then he started studying the data, at that time, still a very difficult thing. And so he came up with theories that were a bit strange. Like he said, okay, many Jews have disappeared from Europe, but that's not because they were killed. That's because they emigrated during the 30s to America, to Argentina, and so to Palestine. And so while that emigration has, of course, taken place to some extent, it's absolutely not to the extent that it would explain the disappearance of millions of people. Anyway, so it is with bizarre but not necessarily evil intentions that this came about, and then it gathered steam. It became a movement in its own right. Now, what happened there in the Holocaust is not exactly the same as what happened to the Hindus. And it's very important. You see, many Hindus nowadays easily use expressions like the Hindu Holocaust. There, as a professional historian, I like to make some distinctions. But nevertheless, the techniques to whitewash this history, they are quite similar. That's why I've extended the term negationism to the situation facing the Hindus.
Yeah. So you're saying that while the term Holocaust or genocide, etc., may not be applicable to the Hindu circumstance,
Mm-hmm.
the tendency to whitewash that history, or to simply negate or deny what happened, is adequately represented by the term negationism, and that is the argument you are making.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, terrific. So now you are going to offer a course in the spring quarter called Distortions in Indian Historiography. and you're going to trace the specific ways in which writing of history, Indian history, began to embrace this phenomenon of negationism substantially, right? So, can you explain the course content itself? Uh, and I understand you have some slides that you would like to share. I'd like to invite you to, kind of go through your slides and explain the
Yeah.
course in a way people can fully appreciate.
Right.
All right.
Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Here we are. Share screen. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Great.
Yeah. You can see it. Here we
We
go.
we can see it.
So I use the term negationism to explain or to describe the persistent denial of a historical crime, in particular genocide. Now, sometimes that denial may be correct, may be justified, namely if that historical crime has not taken place. Everybody or many people talk about it, whereas it is quite fictional. For example, it is now propagated that the Buddhists disappeared from India because they were massacred by the Hindus. Brahmin conspiracy to remove the Buddhists from India. Now, that didn't happen at all. In fact, in 1194, Buddhist universities were destroyed by certain invaders that had stood there for centuries. You see, at that time, Buddhism had existed in India for 17 centuries. So if Hindus had wanted to remove them, they had had time enough. And if Buddhism was still there, it is that Hindus never committed such a genocide. Or, for instance, on a smaller scale, it is said commonly that Saint Thomas brought Christianity to India and that he was killed by Brahmins near Chennai in like 52 or so, um, in the Common Era. Now, that is simply blood libel. That's just like in Europe in the Middle Ages when there was a plague or a well poisoned or something, they blamed the Jews or they blamed the witches. That is called blood libel, and that's committed on a large scale against Hindus these days. So denial sometimes is true, only in this case, in the case of the Hindus, it's a different story. I mean, they are accused of massacres that have never taken place. So in other cases, and that's what we are talking about here, the denial is false. Namely, the massacre did happen, and you can freely speak about that massacre. Namely, massacres of which the Hindus themselves were the victims. The term has become popular because of the Holocaust, which concerns the elimination of Jews from Europe by the Nazis, which was intentional. Now, that is a very important concept because you see, I hear, unfortunately, Hindus um, troubling and disrupting their own case, the case they are making, pleading for some concern, some attention for what happened to Hindus by ignoring this element of intention. For example, it is said that the British committed genocide against the Hindus. Now, that's not true at all. The British conducted very negative policies that resulted in the death of millions of Hindus, but they never had an intention to do so. You see, they conducted policies and then let the chips fall where they may. They didn't care much for Indians, but they didn't per se want them dead. Whereas the Nazis did want to eliminate the Jews, right? So this intention is very important. Like, for example, the biggest mass death in history that we know of was in the Great Leap Forward by Mao Zedong, where estimate 40 million or so people died. Now, Mao never had the intention of killing the Chinese people or of killing the peasants, killing one particular group, and certainly not on that scale. But he conducted very harmful policies. And because of the communist system, he got no feedback. All the provincial authorities were so afraid that they lied to him about the campaign moving on very successfully. And so they kept him in the dark about the effects of his own policy, so they could magnify. Now that's bad, but it's something else than genocide. Now, in the case of the Nazis, they did commit genocide. You know, estimate about 5.3 million killed. This is not the biggest mass killing of history. And indeed, this is where the Hindu case comes in. There have been more Hindu victims, though they had, of course, more space and more time for it. Over 1,000 years, and in the whole subcontinent, there are many more than 6 million Hindus killed. But it's not the same thing. And so the Jews have a certain case when they insist that their Holocaust, or Shoah as they now prefer to call it, was unique. So here's the story I told you, how it starts with a resistor, somebody who can't be suspected of Nazi sympathies or so. But he had a problem with the story as it developed. And then later some people got more principled resistance against this story, became real deniers. And now it's interesting to see what techniques they use. Like, for instance, they clutch at the straw of small successes. Recently, it was revealed that the black athlete Jesse Owens, of whom it is always said that Hitler refused to shake hands with him, that actually he liked his stay in Germany, where there was no segregation like in the American South. And that story of Hitler refusing to give his hand, that was just not true. Now the negationists jubilated. Oh yeah, that's what we've been saying all along. Well, yes, but that has nothing to do with the Holocaust. And so similarly, they play up certain crimes by the Allies. Like there is a book by James Back from Canada, Other Losses, that is about the cruel treatment given by the Allies against German prisoners of war. Now, whether that is correct or not, you see, again, it does not end up denying the Holocaust. It doesn't prove what they hope it proves. Then there have been some abuses of people who claim Holocaust memories who weren't involved at all. And so that you know, that's what you can expect given such a large scale experience. But again, it does not prove what they hope it proves. It does not. It does not deny that an intentional mass killing took place. And so that's the general approach. They try to present an exception as the rule or the rule as an exception. And they magnify um, anything that satisfies their narrative. They minimize the real evidence. The motive is not always lies. You know, some anti-Semitic people do play up that Holocaust denial out of political willfulness. But we see in many cases it is a kind of wishful thinking. People want to whitewash Germany's record, so they just hope that the negationist narrative is true. Um, Most people in this sector, I've interviewed a few, really believe what they are saying. So you can't strictly say that they're liars, even though what they say is not true. You know, you wouldn't court the kind of social ostracism that Holocaust denial brings if you didn't believe your own story, right? And so, mercifully, there are some famous negationists who have seen their mistake and who have grown away from negationism or who have very formally disowned it. Some Hindus take heart from the fact that there is, in some countries, a law against negationism. Now, that is a very bad idea, in my opinion. Such laws are used by the negationists themselves as proofs that the establishment is trying to hide something. Then it so happens that such laws have served as trailblazers for more censorship laws. Then, so I mean, it's bad on the principle of freedom of speech, which I think is a very necessary precondition for democracy. I also note with pleasure that the Jewish community in the United Kingdom has explicitly refused such a muzzle law when it was proposed to them. In this connection, it is, the denial of Holocaust is absolutely objected to in the whole Western world, not, however, in the Muslim world. And so in Europe, we more and more get the problem in schools of pupils who get angry when talk is about the Holocaust, and teachers who even are afraid to teach about the Holocaust. A great promoter of it was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who had one Indian pupil, one Indian assistant who is worth mentioning, V.T. Rajashekar Shetty, who founded the magazine Dalit Voice, which is one of the most explicit anti-Hindu and anti-Brahmin papers in India. Well, there are other genocides. I mean, it exists, almost not as long as humanity exists, but certainly as long as weapons exist, as long as mass killing has been possible. Usually it takes place in war circumstances. Once you start killing, then, killing becomes normal and you go on until you've killed everyone. But even then there are usually rules. Like, for instance, Muhammad killed a Jewish tribe in Medina, about 600 to 900 men, and then he enslaved the women and children, right? So that is a mass killing, and some people will use big words and say that's a genocide. Well, Muhammad did not conduct a genocidal policy vis-a-vis the Jews as such. You see, all other tribes he banished from Arabia. And so the same thing has to be said for the Hindus. You see, the Muslims killed a lot of Hindus, we're going to see it, but their idea was not so much to physically exterminate the Hindus. That could be necessary, so to speak, in a certain military context, but on the whole, they wanted Hindus to convert, to become Muslims. Yeah, there are some more examples. Like, for example, the Dzungar Mongol genocide in 1759. This was by the Chinese army or the Manchu army. And there you find a number of similarities to the Holocaust, like the fact that the Chinese declared these barbarians to be subhuman, Untermenschen, And that they specifically gave instructions, don't be merciful. Their local commanders had to go all the way, not become soft, because then the children would grow up and take revenge, and then our children would have problems. This is the exact same reasoning that Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief among the Nazis, also gave as justification for killing everyone, the children included. Right, anyway, there are many more examples, but so to come to the case of Hindustan, the the killing actually started very shortly after the death of Muhammad, only 4 years later, when they landed not far from Mumbai. And so that was repelled. Then they did some invasions that failed in Sindh. Finally, in 712, they succeeded with Muhammad bin Qasim. And immediately it started with forced conversions, destruction of temples. Then you have a few other big names. I mean, you have many names, but a few big ones that most people will know are Mahmud Ghaznavi, Muhammad Ghori, Malik Kafur, Sikandar Bucci Khan, Timur, who also killed a lot of fellow Muslims, but nevertheless singled out Hindus when he wanted to do mass killing. He specifically attacked in Delhi the Hindu neighborhoods. Babar, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, Aurangzeb, of course, Tipu Sultan. And it goes on into the 20th century. There were more than 1 million people killed in the foundation of Pakistan, in West Pakistan, in Punjab especially. In East Pakistan, it was more long drawn out. Then, when it wanted to become independent in 1971, the Hindus especially were targeted by the Pakistani army and its local Islamist allies. So that, according to an estimate of the Bangladeshi government itself, about 3 million of people were killed, and among them about 80% of Hindus. So in the 20th century alone, the number of Hindu victims already approaches that of the Jewish Holocaust. Again, of course, they had more space, more time. There's no comparison. Hindus, of course, also had an escape route. They could become Muslim, they could convert, whereas the Jews in the Nazi Holocaust did not have that escape. There is an estimate by Professor K.S. Lal that is often quoted that about 80 to 100 million Hindus went missing from Hindu demography. That doesn't mean they have been killed. It may have been collateral damage from harsh economic policies or so. At any rate, they went missing from Hindu demography between 1000 and 1525. Of course, at that time distance, it is difficult to make demographic estimates and so on. Professor Lal himself, of course, said that this was only provisional. This had to be verified and researched into much farther. Unfortunately, I note that since 1979, this figure has not been verified. You see, there are places, there are websites where Hindus claim, oh yeah, genocide and so many million and so on. Well, that's okay as gossip, but by now you see we should do better than that and actually research and verify as best as we can of what figures we are really speaking. Then was it genocide? You see, this word genocide I have a problem with. Genocide means intentionally targeting a community for destruction. Now, again, you see, the Muslim philosophy about this is, that they want to, exercise repression against Hindus, keep them in their place, establish an Islamic state, but not necessarily to physically destroy them. And so a few times, Muslim campaigns against Hindus have taken the character temporarily and locally of a genocide, like during the partition or during the independence war of Bangladesh. The Islamists didn't ask questions. They killed any Hindu they could lay their hand on. But nevertheless, as a whole, you can't speak of a genocide. Um, what the Quran prescribes is that Muslims should rule the world, that everybody should finally convert to Islam. That's something else than to say, oh, we should kill all the unbelievers, right? So there is nothing gained by exaggerations. I want to emphasize this. It is only truth that will prevail. Okay, with that, I've said enough, I think, for us to discuss. So I would open it for questions or objections.
So you can stop sharing if you're done with
Yes.
the slides, right? So let's begin with the most obvious question, Dr. Elst. Uh, Notwithstanding exaggerated numbers of how many Hindus perished through the centuries, and notwithstanding whether the term genocide or Holocaust applies to the Hindu situation in the same way that it applies to the Jewish situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
There must be a way of describing what happened to the Hindus. I mean,
Yes.
it's like what is the word that that best captures what happened to the Hindus, either in the English language or in the Sanskrit language? Is there a word at all?
Yes. Well, we are making one.
Really?
And in fact, I think this course can be an occasion for really, um, really cutting the knot, so to speak, and really
Mm,
deciding for one.
mm,
You see, I myself, for personal purposes, whenever I use Hindi, I use the term Hindu Hatya, which is a
Hatya.
very general term. It doesn't say anything about the intention behind it or the plan behind it, or so. It simply says that Hindus got killed. That
Mhm,
much certainly has happened. Now, I've discussed this with a few people with the Hindu Jana Jagaran Samiti, with a few leading intellectuals. Well, I won't name them, but what they suggested was Hindu Vansha Vichedana or Hindu Vansha Sangharana,
mm,
which means destruction or elimination of the Hindu lineage. That word Vansha, lineage, dynasty, is introduced to explicitate that it is a collective effort. They didn't want to kill just some Hindu for some reason. No, it is against the Hindu community, against Hindu society as such.
yeah,
Okay, so it is, of course, for Hindus to finally decide on this.
yeah.
So, I mean, I make a proposal, but it's really for Hindus to decide. However, there is one thing I'm very particular about. It is very silly and counterproductive for Hindus to say Hindu Holocaust. You see, when Francois Gauthier, the French Indian journalist, opened this museum that ultimately got the name Shivaji Museum in Pune, which is precisely to depict, to document the suffering of the Hindus. He got, all kinds of demands from people. You should call it Hindu Holocaust Museum. At that point, my opinion was also after. They're absolutely not done. First of all, it's very bad diplomacy. The Jewish community is not going to like it, even though they themselves now prefer the term Shoah. Still, the term Holocaust is so identified with the Jewish experience that they will feel like something is taken from them. Moreover, and you don't have many allies in the world, you see, and so with Israel you can get along quite well. So it's really bad diplomacy to offend them. But more importantly, perhaps, is that you can't express your own experience by claiming or stealing the terminology of somebody else's experience. You see, it's very important to draw attention to the specificity of what Hindus have gone through. That's why you should have some Sanskrit term like Hindu Vancha Vichedana or so that really captures this experience, and that henceforth is going to be used specifically for that.
Okay, I think that's I mean, a reasonable perspective on the matter. A lot of the questions in the question box are seeming to tend towards, some kind of uneasiness or discomfort on the part of the Hindus that when you deny the word Holocaust or deny the word genocide to describe what happened to the Hindus, uh, is it the same as construing that nothing happened to the Hindus, or the genocide did not happen, or a Holocaust did not happen? So there's a fine distinction you're drawing, which is that whatever happened to the Hindus, it can't be called genocide or Holocaust because of the specific connotations of the word Holocaust and genocide as they've been applied to the not only the Jewish context but other similar contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for example, here is a question in the question box: could the word Holocaust or genocide be used to describe the mass elimination of Native Americans in the North American continent? Uh, is that a reasonable usage in your view?
Right. Well, I myself have used this term Amerindian genocide, but
Mm,
that's long ago. First, you see, of course, the European discovery of America entailed the death of the majority of Native Americans. However, this was not a matter of warfare, of deliberate genocide. Most of the killing was a result, or most of the dying was a result of the transmission of disease. And so sometimes that also got the character of biological warfare. There are cases where blankets that had been used by people who died of the disease were given to the Native Americans specifically in order to get them killed by the disease. So this actually Europeans themselves have been victims of this kind of warfare too. In 1350, 60 thereabouts, the Mongols who um, besieged a city held by the Italians somewhere on the Black Sea coast. They catapulted dead bodies of people who had died from the plague into the city. And so some people who fled from the city towards Italy took the germs with them and thereby brought the plague into Europe. And so, this biological warfare is not unknown in history. But so in the case of the fate of the Native Americans, it was there, but it was not predominant. You see, even if they had wanted to apply biological warfare, the conquistadores usually weren't even smart enough, but they did it anyway. They brought the germs and they spread everywhere. Nevertheless, what happened later was, well, there was, of course, enslavement until they found that, you see, Africans were better endowed for this terrible life. Uh, but there was also the attempt to destroy the Indian culture. And so then you have all these stories of people forced to attend boarding schools to make them good Christians and so on, to estrange them from their own culture. Same thing in Australia, by the way. And so that's what you could call ethnocide, which means not the destruction of physical people, but the destruction of their identity.
Mm.
And that is far more recent. You see, the colonial killings are old in the sense that even in the later part of the colonial period, they didn't happen anymore. But, you know, this ethnocide happened till the very end of the colonial history.
So the Islamic efforts to discipline Hindus into either converting into Islam or paying for not converting with their death, could that be construed within the term ethnocide, in your view?
Yes. Yes, there, of course, the intention is to deprive Hindus of their separate identity and
Right.
to absorb them into the Islamic community.
Mm, right. Okay, interesting. It's a very interesting distinction you are drawing. Now, here's another. There are a couple of questions in the question box on this. Um, it's interesting that a lot of authors, contemporary authors, are throwing around the word genocide rather casually nowadays to describe a riots in India in which apparently the Hindus are committing genocide against the Muslims as late as just last year.
Mhm.
So there doesn't seem to me this sensitivity that you are expecting of the Hindus uh, being applied to just simply claim the Hindus are the ones committing genocide against the Muslims, as they did during the riots in Delhi just a few months ago,
Mhm.
a year ago maybe, or the so-called imagined killings of Buddhists, which they did many centuries ago, and so on. So, so what's your view about this selective commitment to integrity with the word with the use of the word genocide? And particularly denying the Hindus the use of the word, whereas it can be used indiscriminately against them, accusing
Mhm.
them of this and that, with hardly any evidence to go with it, really speaking.
Yes. Well, on the part of foreign journalists, this is very largely the effect of ignorance. You
Yeah.
see, they don't know the situation in India, and they are captive to the bottleneck of the information flow from India, which is held by the so-called secularists. And so, you know, those people poison the information stream, making it anti-Hindu. And so that's what many people who don't care to check the information themselves have to go by.
Mm.
Then, secondly, what should also be understood now is that in the actual West, the last 20 years or so, not everyone, but specifically the journalist and academic class, have a strong pro-Islamic bias because you see they are up in arms against nationalists in the West. Now these nationalists, since the 90s especially, have turned against Islam. Often before they were for Islam, they thought it was conservative, it was anti-communist. They also, I mean, many of them were also anti-Semitic, so they liked Islam to be anti-Jewish. But so, since about the turn of the century, that has changed because Islam is posing more and more of an immediate problem in the West. So, those journalists and leftist academics have turned pro Islamic. And so they are seeing the news about India through that lens. And so for them, you see, they hate, you know, the rednecks and what have you, the right in America, Trump and so on, and they project that onto India, like forgetting that Modi preceded Trump in office by 2 years. They say, oh, Modi is India's answer to Trump. That's what I recently read in a Western paper. And so that just predisposes them to not believe anything favorable about the Hindus and to eagerly believe everything unfavorable about them.
Yeah. So you think that the information flow is getting poisoned by the Indian secular historians and narrators, journalists themselves, and therefore the Western counterparts are so gullible that they believe this flow, this information flow, and trust the narratives that they're hearing, and then they go and write articles in New York Times and Washington Post as though whatever they
Mhm.
heard from India was absolutely true.
Yes, I do think, though, that in the case of America, probably the coming years are going to see a certain diminishing of this anti-Hindu and anti-India animus because of the changing world situation.
Hmm.
You see, America used to be friends with Pakistan, which has now more or less become a colony of China. So America's role there is much less already. Then they see the problem of Islamic terrorism, of which Pakistan is a hub. But mainly, the main reason for the change in perspective is that now they need India as a counterweight against China. So you see, one great thing that Trump did, I mean, he did many funny and bizarre things and so on, but he did a very good thing, namely, he made friends with India. He finally put an end to the alliance with Pakistan, which was held even by presidents like Bush, who were up in arms against Islamic terrorism and still supported Pakistan. So you see, that has changed, and I don't think that Joe Biden is going to turn the clock back because India is now a necessity, and so therefore I think that to the extent that the government influences the media, that's not altogether true, but for a part it is true. The media are going to be more lenient with India. Now, specifically with Hinduism, that is a different matter. There is, apart from the stuff that they are fed from India, there is also a typically Western prejudice about Hinduism. Namely, it is the caste system.
Right.
Many people think that Hinduism is caste, holy caste, and nothing but caste. And so, you see, Westerners have a certain guilt feeling about their history of racial slavery. And then finally, they fought a war in America against it. Britain even imposed the abolition of slavery on the Ottoman Empire, on the Mughal Empire. So, you know, the West is a bit guilty of slavery. It also has the merit of abolishing slavery. But to really drive that point home, many Westerners have this complex of trying to save the whole world and all of humanity from whatever remains of slavery. And this is where the caste system comes in. So many people think, first of all, that the caste system is still in full, they don't understand the fact of change. And then they have also been taught about the Aryan invasion theory, that the caste system is really an imposition of a kind of apartheid by whitish Aryan invaders on the darker natives. And so everything that you hear about Black Lives Matter and so on, that is immediately projected onto India. And so many Westerners have this fundamentally negative attitude about India that makes them much less critical about all the news they hear accusing Hindus.
Right. So, I mean, that's a much bigger problem to address, really.
Yeah.
Now, I want to turn to your course, and I want to, in your course, I want to tell the audience here that in your course, you're going to explore the phenomenon of negationism and the specific ways in which the writing of history, Indian history, has been distorted, almost deliberately ignoring facts of history, in order to spin a narrative, and how that has come about and how that is sustained in contemporary times. It's really not gone away. I mean, there is the community of scholars who are committed to that this specific form of distortion and denial is still very much in place today in the Indian,
Yeah.
even in the Indian academia. Can you share a little bit about your course in the next few minutes?
Well, we're going to start at the beginning. I mean, the beginning of the relevant part of history writing, which is at the end of the British period and the beginning of independence, when you have a rather unassuming historiography that stays close to the data. That has a project, though, which is quite close to nationalism in the sense that it tried to highlight the merits of ancient Indian culture. Your beginning was made with the writing of chemistry in ancient India, physics in ancient India, and so on. Then it also made efforts to show the intrinsic unity of India. You see, there was a British narrative that, India is not really a unity. It has been forged as a unity by Queen Victoria. As Churchill said, India is not more a unity than the equator. It's just a line on the map. And so that's just not correct. That's historically not correct. And so, yeah, I mean, you could call that too a form of negationism, or at least a form of history denial, because here the data are very strong and show that, first of all, an ideal, a cultural ideal of Indian unity was already present 3,000 years ago. And it was often very close to physical realization, as under the Mauryas. But so that positive, upbeat phase of history ended with especially Indira, already a little bit under Nehru and his education minister Maulana Azad. But the real breakthrough was was under Indira. And so then you get criticisms of the earlier phase of R.C. Majumdar with his history of the Indian people. That was the classical school. That was acceptable history. Of course, you could, fuss about details, but that was a positive, objective, and to a little extent nationalist history. So that was then really condemned by the leftist school that came to power in the educational sector around 1970-75. This has to do with the power equation at the time. Indira Gandhi needed support because she had an internal intra-Congress power struggle. So she leaned heavily on the left. And so the trade-off was that the formal, the perks of power, doling out jobs and so on, that was left to the Congress people. But the left insisted on getting the real power of determining the contents of the school books, of the cultural projects, and so on. And so then the left started determining the history books and so on, and criminalizing more and more the more objective school of history. So that we're certainly going to study quite closely how and why that was done. And then why it ultimately had to land into very strange distortions of history, like a case study that is not too far off is the case of Audrey Truschke, a defense of Aurangzeb which flies in the face of so many original documents. Um, so the psychology behind how it is possible should be studied, but also the marriage that Hindus have already built up in refuting this. You see, there are many good articles and a few books that clearly explain the opposite case. And so that will be studied closely also.
Yeah.
Then finally, some cases where Hindus themselves are making bad mistakes, because to counter this, you have to provide a good narrative with good history. And so that is not what it should be at the moment. In fact, you see, for having a Hindu government already for 7 years, I think that not much has been done yet. And so many people are independently making good efforts. And so more and more publications are seeing the light of day. But, that is all not very influential compared to the official channels. For most people, the only history they'll ever learn is what they learn in school. And then maybe some Bollywood historical movies that also are mostly on the anti-Hindu side. So you see, to change that at an official plane, that will take a political effort. But
Right.
the correcting of history, that is already going on.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Elst. So the course again that he's offering in the spring quarter is titled, Distortions in the Historiography of India. And, by looking at samples, examples, a whole excavation of this distortion and how it has unfolded will emerge in that course. So we want to put up a quick survey. Ankur, can you put up a survey very quickly for the, we just want to know how many of you are interested in the course. We'll be in touch with you. All we want you to say is yes or no, and we'll move forward with your answers. So Ankur, can you show me the progression of the answers or no?
We have 56 out of 104 who have completed it, 60. About 30 say yes, they're interested, 30 say no. And maybe we can announce our $100 discount until March 31st. So the course costs $400, but if you sign up by March 31st, you'll get in for $300. This was an amazing conversation. We'll still take some more questions, but you can imagine over 11 weeks, the kind of conversation that's going to happen in this course. You want to be a part of it. I want to be a part of it. It's going to be important. And as Dr. Elst said, this could be part of the journey towards developing the language so that we can, as Hindus and allies, address the distortions in Indian historiography. So this is an important course. Please fill out the survey that's up right now, just yes or no. Again, $100 discount until March 31st. There's a lot more questions in the Q&A box, but let me just hand it back to Kalyanji. We also have some hands raised in the participant window. If you can type those questions out, that'd be better. Thank you so far for participating in this webinar.
All right. So where do we stand on the results of the poll? Can you share it?
Let's give people another 30 seconds. We've just been up for
Okay.
a minute and 20. Please complete the survey, click around, find it, and then just give us a yes or a no, and then I'll share it.
Okay. Okay, good. So, Dr. Elst, as a historian, what drives a historian to deliberately suppress obvious facts in order to spin a story that fits their preconceptions? I mean, how, and for example, what comes to mind is, a very stark example of somebody like Romila Thapar claiming almost very recently that the archaeological excavations under the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya are in fact totally disputed, And and she the way she writes is, well, some claim that there was a mandir, but there are others who dispute it. Other eminent historians, eminent archaeologists, they simply dispute it. So therefore, this is nobody can be really sure about it. So in other words, it's a kind of a waving of a hand and obfuscating a fact can no longer be denied. But yet she denies it. At the risk, at putting at risk her own reputation as a historian for all time to come, because she is going to get exposed in course of time as as completely unreliable as a historian. So why do they do that?
Yes.
What is your view on that?
Well, most of the historians who claimed in the 90s that there never had been a temple there have gone completely silent. They just don't want any attention anymore to the Ayodhya controversy because they know they've lost.
Yeah.
In the case of, well, pretty old people by now, like Romila Thapar, perhaps it is too late now to change their minds. Of course, there is already a certain retreat in throwing their hands up and saying, yeah, we will never know, and there are different opinions and so on. That's already something else than what she used to write in '89 when she authored this statement about the political abuse of history. So what motivates them usually, I mean, I don't speak about like real conscious deliberate liars, but you see, usually they think that they are doing something good. Like there is the Kannada writer S.L. Bhairappa. You see, he's an eyewitness. You see, he was in the relevant administration for the textbooks and so on. And so he lived through the day that, some order came from higher up. Oh yeah, we have to rewrite everything and we have to erase the history of religious conflict because that is negative for the relations between the communities today. So he protested, he says, you can't tamper with history and so on. So he was promoted away. I mean, they couldn't fire him, but so he was shunted out of this particular project. Now, the reason was that his chiefs thought that they were doing something good, that society today would become better by tampering with history, and so very many people think so. And so they're not very sure about what is true or not, but they are very sure about saying this is good, whether true or not, it's beneficial.
Yeah.
That's mostly the reason.
And that and again, what is beneficial then becomes a matter of personal bias and personal predisposition.
Yeah.
And just kind of brought us to this where we are today. So Ankur, can you throw up the results briefly? Okay, so we got 77 people responding. There are many more who have just chosen not to respond. You can say no. I mean, people who have not responded, I would encourage you to still say no. If you're not interested, it's a quick, no harm done, okay? All right, so let's take a few more questions from the question box, okay? So let's take this, the case of the Bengal famines.
Yeah.
Which were triggered by diversion of food to the war effort and so on. Now, does that, like a concentrated event which results in the large-scale death, does that merit the term genocide, or do we have to again, honor the integrity of that word and then come up with something else to explain what happened there? Yeah.
Okay, it's a mixed case. I mean, strictly no, it is not genocide in the sense that the English didn't care about the Indians. Yeah. So whether so many millions of Bengalis died, they didn't care one way or the other. In fact, they had the war on their minds. They wanted to win. The Bengalis weren't fighting them. In fact, they were working for them.
Mm.
But so, that was a price they thought worth paying. Then, when it was brought to Churchill's notice that there was a solution, namely importation of grain from Australia, well, then he made a decision that, I wouldn't call it genocide, but it is guilty. Um, where he thought, well, let those Indians die, let them have it.
Yeah.
So that I think is not acceptable. Maybe I wouldn't call
Yeah.
it genocide. Nevertheless, it's weighing. It should be weighing on his conscience. Yes.
Right. Now, here's another question. You know, the the use of the word genocide, in retrospect, was applied to the Armenian
Yeah.
case, and I myself have been in Armenia, and I've visited the Armenian genocide museum in their main
Yerevan.
city,
Yeah.
Yerevan, yeah, Yerevan, which is very, I mean, quite a horrific story that they've told about what happened to the Armenian people. Uh, so, was the word genocide in place before the Jewish Holocaust, or was it invented to describe the Jewish Holocaust
No,
in Germany?
it was invented after 1945
It was invented.
when the United Nations, you know, created a convention against genocide.
Hmm.
So it was created for that occasion. The word Holocaust, however, existed. And you see, it's a biblical word that it's from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Greek translation made by Jews themselves. And so their Holocaust means a complete burning. That is to say, you make a sacrifice where you do not then later use the sacrifice as prasad, um, as sacrificial nutrition of the people around, but where instead you destroy the whole sacrifice. So you offer an animal and you burn it till nothing edible remains. That's the literal meaning of the word Holocaust. Now, that was used to describe the Armenian genocide. At one point, the Armenians took refuge in the city of Urfa, which is disputed between Syria and Turkey. And then, rather than besieging the city and risking military losses and so on, the Turks just decided to burn the city. And so that was a literal burning sacrifice. That was a Holocaust. So that is where the word Holocaust was first used in the modern sense.
Mm.
But then after the Jewish experience, and at that point, hardly anyone in the world talked about the Armenian case. So after the Jewish experience, it became more or less, property of the Jewish community.
Right. Okay. Okay. So let's take a couple more questions. What about the the evidence of the Hindu temples being destroyed under the Islamic rules? I mean, we know Sitaram Goel has himself documented so many temples, and
Mhm.
it's probably not even a complete list. I mean, it's what he could compile during
No,
his
no,
time.
it's definitely not a complete list. Like of the province of Kerala, he lists only a handful.
Yeah.
And so by now a book has been written that lists hundreds. So
Mm.
of course the list is not complete. But what is important is that this list of 1850 thereabouts has not been refuted at all. There had been one attempt by Richard Eaton to refute the case of a single mosque, and even that hasn't succeeded. That Sitaram Goel was still alive to refute.
Mm.
And all the others are just standing, untouched.
Yeah.
So there the negationists have to defend. They have to concede that they haven't been able to dislodge this case for all these temple destructions.
Yeah. So, in the particularly in the face of the evidence standing right there. Like for example, I mean, it's if you would go to the Jnanavapi mosque in the Kashi, for example, right? The Kashi Vishwanatha temple. Is that the same thing? The Jnanavapi mosque there?
Well, the Gyanvapi Mosque is standing on the original site of the Kashi Vishwanath, but
Yeah,
then a make-do small Kashi Vishwanath was built alongside it
yeah,
afterwards. Yes.
right. So, in the face of such a massive amount of evidence, physical standing evidence, right? It is particularly brazen to carry on this kind of negationist history writing. Uh, I mean, I'm surprised uh, that it's gone on and on without an adequate
Mm-hmm.
rebuttal and really kind of complete, uh, you know, destruction of this narrative. But still, it's around. It's the common inheritance of all Hindus, where you can go on and on arguing about whether Tipu Sultan was a good person or not, or
Mm-hmm.
Aurangzeb was such a wonderful person or not, and so on. How do you explain this weird, brazen avoidance of facts in this history writing, in your view?
Well, in the case of Ayodhya, you could still make a certain case that there had not been a temple there. Well, actually, the evidence for the temple was quite overwhelming. But in the circumstances of those days, you might get away with it for a while, until, of course, the scholars had compiled the evidence and the archaeological survey had excavated the site. But in the case of Kashi and also of Mathura, there is just no case to be made. I mean, it's so obvious. There are descriptions, if there are instructions of Aurangzeb to demolish them, and it was not even the first time they were being demolished. Then in Kashi, you can see in the architecture of the mosque still the remains of the original temple. So you see there even won't be any scope for any discussion at all. There's only the political discussion. Do we want to rebuild the temples on these sites?
Right. But yet the negationism goes on and on, even today, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so the as far as the claim of 80 to 100 million Hindus having been victims of some kind of violence or the other, periodically through many incidents, uh, bursting out from time to time over a long period of time, several hundred years. What in your view is the appropriate way of establishing a critical historical record? Because while there are many fragmented efforts going on here and there, it's not really amounting to an adequate and appropriate, well documented, well referenced historical record yet. I mean, is that a fair thing to say?
Well, it's a really big job, and there is no shortcut. You
Yeah,
know, I mean, all these Islamic emperors have to be looked into. All their chronicles and so on have to be scouted for information.
yeah,
Then, moreover, we should remain aware that our information is not complete.
yeah,
Sometimes the chronicles exaggerate. That's also what the negationists also play up. They say, okay, if the Mahasari Alamgiri writes about Aurangzeb that he had tens of thousands of temples destroyed, is this not an exaggeration? Did they not want to flatter Aurangzeb or his hearers? Um, but then conversely, there is also the fact that many crimes against humanity, so to speak, have gone unreported, or the reports have been lost. So, and I mean, this is ancient history. This is more demanding to get at the facts than in the case of contemporary history.
yeah.
So there's a lot of historians are going to have to work on this.
Right. Uh, and perhaps it could be said that from the Hindu perspective, a critical mass of committed historians who are, you know, uh, committed to the ideal of objectivity, even if they cannot achieve it in reality,
Mm.
who are willing to sift through the data, and explore historical records, uh, and avoid exaggeration on either side of the side of the negationists,
Mm.
or on the side of playing up the numbers just to make a sensational point. Um, that kind of critical mass of historians has not quite come together yet in either in India or anywhere else for that
Mm.
matter. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
Well, yeah, that describes the situation.
Hmm.
And so the reason is, one thing is that nobody wants to offend Islam nowadays.
Hmm.
That counts both for the West and for India. That certainly counts for the BJP. You see, they maintain a very Islam-friendly policy. Like recently, there was some Shia cleric who went to court to have 26 verses from the Quran removed.
Hmm.
So immediately, not just the Sunni establishment protested against it, but also the BJP government. And so, they give extra, reserved seats in colleges and so on for Muslim students and so on. So they try to put up a really nice pro-Muslim face. And so they certainly are not going to promote, or certainly don't want to be seen to promote anything critical of Islam. So I think their historians are, to a large extent, on their own. At
Hmm.
least they don't punish critical inquiries into Islam. That's already progress. But so
Yeah.
no, and the outside world especially has no reason to favor Hindus above Muslims. At least that's the situation at the moment. So yes, I think scholars are going to have to take it upon themselves and present a better and better case until finally you see it tilts the balance.
Yeah. Okay. So now, the here's a question. The Somehow the word genocide in the context of people getting killed on a mass scale with the intent of exterminating them has been given a great deal of prominence by the United Nations, The Hague, and so
Hmm.
on. But ethnocide as a word has not really gained that kind of traction, and it somehow seems to be much less of an infringement, or much less of a crime than genocide.
Yes.
Why has it not gained traction? And if you do you think, and is there any value in pursuing that word as a legitimate case?
Well, there is certainly a value in pursuing that word, namely in all the cases where it applies.
Yeah.
And it applies on a large scale. And that's also why it has difficulty in being accepted, because many of the powerful states in the world do practice it to some extent.
Mm.
Like, for instance, a totally peaceful, non-violent example is France. You have a number of minorities there, the Bretons, the Alsace Germans, the Flemings, the Basques, and so on. Now, the French policy is to destroy these minorities not by killing them, but by enforcing French education so that children get alienated from their native language. And so, in a few generations, that language disappears and their feeling of a separate identity disappears. And so they end up being absorbed into the French nation. So, strictly speaking, you could call that ethnocide.
Mm.
And so, in more violent forms, in more drastic forms, it takes place in many countries. And so all those countries don't want that issue to be raised. In China, for example, you have a bit of an overlap. There are attempts to make the Tibetans and the Uyghurs as Chinese as possible, to introduce Chinese in their school curriculum and so on. At the same time, there are claims, and here I'm a bit skeptical, but you see, I know serious politicians who make claims that the Chinese are trying to impose birth control on nowadays the Uyghurs in the west of the People's Republic, and try to enforce even sterilization, just like what Sanjay Gandhi did in the 70s in India. I don't know if that's true, but you see, that would already go from ethnocide to genocide, not by killing people, but by at least preventing them from creating a next generation. Uh, but the term ethnocide is, of course, relatively justified in the sense that they are trying to make their minorities Chinese. That's what you would call ethnocide. But you will see there that ethnocide is still not as drastic as genocide, a lot less, because there need not be any killing involved.
Yeah.
So maybe many Hindus want a bit of stronger stuff than ethnocide.
Right. Because, I mean, clearly there were many, many sequences of events that surely, in terms of the numbers of Hindus killed, approach levels of near genocidal kind of scale, even though the intent may not have been to kill all Hindus and eliminate them entirely, which is one of the core principles you are articulating in favor of the word
Mm-hmm.
genocide, and why not to use that for the Indian in the Hindu situation. Very good. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, and at the end of the day, it's important to recognize is that negationism, as articulated by Dr. Konrad Elst, is the phenomenon of denying certain basic historical facts as though they never happened, and sidestepping those facts in building a narrative about what really happened. Okay, and negationism is very much alive and well in the writing of India's history even today. And the course that he's going to teach is going to explore the specific history of negationism and these ways in which it distorts India's history, and look at specific scholars who participated in that process. So I invite all of you to join that course. Please register as soon as you can. Ankur is putting up the link for the course. We look forward to seeing you in the course very soon. Thank you all for participating in this webinar today. Namaste, everybody, and thank you. And Dr. Elst, thank you very much for your participation
Yes.
in the webinar.
Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you. Bye-bye.